Good afternoon and welcome to this second event of Politico's Energy Vision series. My name is Aitor Hernandez Morales and I'm an energy and climate reporter for Politico Europe here in Brussels. And today I will be moderating this panel discussion, which is the second as part of this series, which gathers energy and climate stakeholders to tackle the challenges of the green transition. We'll be talking about the different ways in which we can approach the goals that have been set to green the continent. Today's topic is the sectoral decarbonization of Europe by 2050, a key issue as the bloc faces more ambitious 2030 targets, like those rolled out by Commission President Ursula von der Leyen last week, and moves forward towards the wider 2050 climate neutrality goal. Going neutral means switching steel production from coal to hydrogen, expanding the penetration of renewable energy, fostering green investments, and going further in the decarbonization of industrial and transport sectors. These are all key issues because industrial decarbonization could work if chemicals, fuel, cement, and steel undertake energy-efficient improvements. They also require a switch to heat generated from electricity and a massive ramp-up of the use of hydrogen and biofuels, among other issues, none of which are cheap. We'll be discussing the challenges ahead with our panel of EU policymakers and business leaders, and we are sure that the chat will be compelling. But before we get to it, it's time to set a few housekeeping rules. We'd like to first thank our partner in this event, that's Shell, and we'd like to thank all of you for joining us online. If you'd like to participate with us, you can do so by tweeting about this event using the hashtag EnergyVisions and directing your tweets at EventsPolitico. And you can also ask questions via Slido using the hashtag EnergyVisions. If you're following us from Facebook or Twitter, please go to slido.com from your computer or phone and use the hashtag EnergyVisions to ask your question. If instead you're following us from the event website, Slido is embedded below the livestream window. And now, before we get started, here's a word from Hubert Vigeveno, a downstream director and member of the executive committee of Shell, our partner for this event. Mr. Vigeveno will be taking your questions via Slido, so if you have any questions for him, please make them now.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Aitor. And thank you all for joining this event, whether it is virtually or in person at the studio, whether you are watching right now or perhaps a bit later. In fact, those different ways show me how ingenious, determined, and versatile society can be when there is so much at stake. Whether we face challenges as serious as COVID-19 or climate change, when we know we have to keep talking to each other, working together, and finding the best ways to take action. The European Union's Green Deal is an excellent example of the kind of action the world needs to take to tackle climate change. Shell supports its target of achieving climate neutrality by 2050. This target means finding ways to stop adding to the stock of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere in just a few decades. In other words, achieving net zero emissions and doing it very, very fast. Last week, President von der Leyen announced the increase of the EU's 2030 climate target to a 55% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. This is a huge challenge, but it is one that Shell supports. The 55% target would put the EU on a path which we haven't seen before. A path towards climate neutrality. It would also provide the long-term certainty that businesses need to invest in lower carbon projects. In practice, this goal requires decisive policy action. Action to cut emissions at a faster rate across all sectors at the same time, and to support the industrial competitiveness of the EU. And it is here that the economic recovery instrument has a key role to play. The EU's emission trading system will also need to reform. Industry in the EU must be kept competitive in relation to carbon costs. As for carbon sinks, there must be a massive speeding up and increase in their role. And finally, a sectoral approach will be crucial to success and should be at the heart of the Green Deal. This approach is about identifying a path to net zero for each sector, and I will explain a bit how later. The challenge may be great, but the Green Deal is one that turns ambitious plans into urgent action. And we all need to take urgent action. Shell's own ambition is to be net zero emissions energy business by 2050 or sooner, in step with society and our customers. We will work towards this in 3 ways. First, we aim to be net zero emissions from the making of our own products. Secondly, we seek to reduce the carbon intensity of the products we sell. This means selling more hydrogen, more biofuels, more renewable electricity. Thirdly, and finally, we as a business that supplies energies will work with each sector that uses energy, like aviation, like heavy freight, and like shipping. We will help them to find their own path to net zero. And this is the sectorial approach that I will outline. Our ambition will mean working with others in a way and at a scale not seen before. And the business plans we have today will not make Shell's ambition a reality. Over time, those plans will have to change as society and our customers also change. So, demand is absolutely key. And this is where policy is key. For instance, in Germany, at our Rhineland refinery, we are working with partners to build the world's largest PM electrolyzer to produce hydrogen using renewable energy. This production of so-called green hydrogen is a significant step in testing the feasibility of a hydrogen network on a large industrial scale. The hydrogen would be used not only in the chemical processing at the site, but in future, it could also supply, for example, cars and lorries at our retail sites. We have the infrastructure, the system, and the people to do it, but we need the right policies to encourage demand. These complex dynamics are why Shell is focusing on a sectoral approach. In brief, this approach means working with others to synchronize the demand for lower carbon energy in key sectors with the investment in infrastructure and supply. It means balancing supply and demand. And this is especially important in the sectors where change is the hardest to achieve. Sectors like road freight and industry, both represented here today, or aviation, or shipping. Fro Gotaland, the work you have sponsored on a sectorial approach is very encouraging. Thank you very much. I hope it can become a guiding principle for the implementation of the Green Deal, because it will ensure that each key economic sector has a clear route to net zero. And while the action needed in every sector will vary, I believe that they all share the same 3 ways to make progress. First, improve energy efficiency. Second, turn to lower carbon energy products. And thirdly, offset or store away emissions that cannot be avoided. The businesses that make up each sector must come together to work out how to take action in each area that leads to net zero. They need to get to a point where they can say, this is the path to net zero. These are the things that could block it. And this is what we need to compete and succeed. And to complete the picture, that is when sectors need policymakers to step in, to remove those blocks, to clear the way to success. I believe that is how to turn ambitious plans into urgent action. It is how we can work together to achieve real and lasting change. And it will be essential if the EU wants to achieve its bold targets. I look forward to answering your questions and hearing the panel discussions. Thank you. Merci. Tak. Und Dankeschön.
Thank you, Ert. So the first question we have from the audience is from Tim Davidson. He asks, how is Shell working with other sectors to achieve climate neutrality?
Yeah, Tim, thank you very much for your question. Actually, we're working on a sectoral approach for all the sectors in which we operate or where the change is needed the most. For example, if you look at the aviation sector, I personally participated in various roundtables working together with airlines, airports, and regulators around the position of sustainable aviation fuel in the aviation sector, given that it's such a hard to abate sector. We are doing some similar things in the road transport sector, where I am talking also with original equipment manufacturers and their customers, or the shipping sector, where we work with port authorities and with the various customers we have. Basically, what we do when we talk to these sectors, we talk around our aspirations to produce green hydrogen. What is required for changing infrastructure, and how do you really help decarbonizing difficult sectors like heavy duty? And I can give you many examples of what we're doing. For instance, in the Rotterdam, we're putting an electrolyzer, which is linked to the tender we just won on HKN. And then we are working with the OEMs to ensure that we have a synchronized development to ensure that the freight transport can actually utilize these zero emissions. So that's just one example of one sector. But as I said, it's one sector at a time. It's not just an aggregated average. And every sector is quite specific in what will be required. But having worked at this now for a while, I do believe that for every sector, there's an answer, as long as we work together and we get the right policy around that as well.
So we have another question from the audience. P. Keating asks, what role do you see liquid fuels playing in the transport sector? Can e-fuels be ready at scale and cost to support decarbonization of passenger cars?
I think e-fuels play a key role, particularly for passenger cars. Because if I look at what we're using now, to a certain extent, to decarbonize the passenger car pool, it's very much driven by biofuels. But biofuels, one would argue, are actually could be used in harder to abate sectors like aviation for sustainable aviation fuel. If you look at the network around e-fluids or electric charging, this is really something that we are ramping up a lot of our investments to ensure that we are able to offer the propositions to our customers around taking away the driving anxiety around electric charging. We're doing that together with the network and together with our OEMs. One thing I would say is that this is where supply and demand need to come together. So we are ready, and we already do that, to invest many of these activities. If you look at something different like hydrogen, we already have 80 hydrogen retail sites in Germany, but we really need to develop the demand to be able to fulfill the investments we're doing in that area. So those are just two small examples I would like to give.
Thank you, Hubert. And now let's move on to the main event and get to meet some of our panelists. So joining us here in Brussels, we have Stefan Vergoot from the European Commission. He is the advisor for emission reduction strategies, research and innovation at DG Klima. With us as well is Marco Mensik. He is the Director General of the European Chemical Industry Council. And then joining us remotely, we have Swedish MEP Jytte Guteland, the Socialist and Democrats coordinator on the Parliament's ENVI committee. And finally, last but not least, Jessica Sandström, Senior Vice President for Product Management at Volvo Trucks. Thank you, all of you, for joining us. So, if we can begin, the big news these days is obviously the European Commission's new 2030 climate targets. Brussels' impact assessment shows that that coal, fossil fuels, and non-ferrous metals will be seriously impacted by these new goals. So, I'd like to begin by turning to Stefan. What does all of this mean for energy-intensive industries and for their workers?
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this event. Indeed, it comes at a very good moment in time, because only last week, President von der Leyen announced the new target for 2030 of at least minus 55% compared to 1990. And first, before going into more specifics, I would like to highlight the importance of this, and it has also been accompanied by a communication that goes into the various aspects of this target. It is accompanied by an amendment to the climate law, where we enshrine that target in our proposal for the climate law that is currently in co-decision in Council and Parliament. And it also proposes this, that we actually update our NDC under the Paris Agreement. And that is also crucially important because, of course, we cannot solve climate change on our own. We need our international partners to join. And in that context, it's also quite interesting that today the president of China has announced that China will go climate neutral by 2060. So that is also an important announcement today. All that work has been accompanied, as requested indeed, by stakeholders and by the Council and the Parliament, by an in-depth impact assessment that goes very much into the details of what that means, what such a target means. And the first point I would like to make in terms of the importance for industry and the manufacturing sector is that our impact assessment shows that first and foremost, the transition towards these targets in 2030 and 2050 is an investment agenda. And that goes squarely together with what is going on in our economy, that we need to exit the crisis as a result of COVID, and that we need to invest in our economy to get our economy back on track. So by doing so, we have said before that we need to do that by investing in things that also for the long term put us on the right track in the twin transition of digital and green transformation. And this increased target gives us the opportunity, together with the recovery and resilience facility and the plans that member states will submit, to indeed invest in those solutions. And that can be very concrete because we will launch a renovation wave, which means that we will need more products in our construction sector in order to make our homes efficient and low carbon. It means we will have to invest in industry. For instance, we are working on batteries. We have launched a hydrogen strategy. So all those areas are actually, and we have also in our annual growth strategy, actually highlighted 7 flagship areas where we invite member states to use the recovery and resilience facility to invest in these technologies already now, not waiting until 2030, but to kickstart indeed that transition. The impact assessment, I would also like to mention, goes very much into the sectoral approach and looking how does this transition look like for each and every sector. I wouldn't say into the very detail of each subsector in industry, but it gives indeed an assessment of what does it mean for the power sector, for instance, where we will see very deep reductions. And the power sector is very much at the heart of the transition because on the one hand, with renewables becoming much cheaper, we can make that the backbone for also decarbonizing other sectors, in particular the industry. So if we get more renewables, cheaper renewables, we can provide that also as a solution for the industrial sectors, also potentially transformed into hydrogen. So that is key, that fast transformation of the power sector with ever cheaper renewables. But also at the same time, you look at the other sectors. What does it mean for buildings? What does it mean for the industrial sector? What does it mean for the transport sector? We see quite large differences. And what we also see is that in certain sectors it goes a bit slower. For instance, in the industrial sector, we have a lower potential in a perspective of 2030. But it also means that at the same time as we are only 1 to 2 investment cycles away, we need to invest in research and innovation and in creating lead markets for actually larger deployment post-2030. That is also an important element, I think, of our strategy, that we develop the breakthrough technologies that over time can also, in the longer term, mean larger reductions in the industrial sectors and for instance, in heavy-duty transports. And finally, a last point, it's not just an analysis, it's also a preview on how we need to change our policies. The previous speaker indicated it doesn't happen just by itself, it is a huge challenge, and how we can update our policies, the ETS, effort sharing, the regulations relating to sinks, but also our transport policies, renewable energy directive, energy efficiency, and also I would like to add infrastructure. It's sometimes something that is not sufficiently highlighted, But to get low carbon and zero carbon energy carriers into the system, we need to change our infrastructure. And we have the tools, at least also at European level, with the Alternative Fuels Infrastructure Directive and the 10E and the 10T to also make changes there, and they're also up for revision.
Stefan, you mentioned the automotive sector, and I want to take the opportunity to bring Jessica into this. So, Jessica, I wanted to ask, the automotive sector obviously is going to require technological advances to decarbonize, but it's also going to be very important to completely reconfigure how the supply chains work in terms of the production. So I wanted to ask, do you consider that your side of the industry is up for that challenge and up for making it happen within the timelines that the Commission is floating?
Yeah, absolutely. But as we have been into already in this discussion, it requires a much broader approach compared to what we have seen earlier. We really need to look outside the truck and have a system approach, the well to wheel. And that means that we need to have the supply and demand ready at the same time. And it comes to what type of energy source will we use and make sure that that is really green. And at the same time, making sure that our customers really can make the shift, because it's a big shift for us. But what is also really important to understand is that it's a big shift for the logistic setup today. If we are talking about really long distance driving, for instance, maybe we need to change that. You were just into the question on infrastructure. It needs to be available, because otherwise the customers will not dare to invest in new technologies and really take this step, because they need to be able to fulfill their transport missions. So I think from our perspective, yes, we are really ready to go into this challenge, but we also need to be much more open compared to how we usually act and talk to other players in the industry to make sure that the system is ready.
So what about your sector, Marco? What's the state of play in the chemicals industry?
Let me first say a few words on chemical industry, because I think there's several parts of the industry which will face a different approach. Over the years, we've reduced our emissions already significantly with a focus to say on N2O, on laughing gas. You'll see that growth in production met efficiency, which means the CO2 emissions themselves have gone down less. And that's where, to a large part of the sector, breakthrough technology is going to be needed. Now, if you split the sector in parts, looking at Eurostat, which is what Steph also has to do for the modeling, there's about 28,000 entities in Eurostat. We think we know about 11,000 of them. Quite a large share of those in the number of companies depend on electricity and heat from grids. They're going to need decarbonized electricity to come into the companies. Second is that there is a larger group where still large wind contracts, for example, can help. And I think if you now see we have about the largest direct contract with the wind sector as we speak. Investments need to take place in new technologies of today, and work takes place on breakthrough technology. So we started with technology scans like everyone. It's clear we're going to need them all. We are the largest consumer and producer of hydrogen, so we'll have a central role there. And by the way, we're colorblind on hydrogen. I think that's an important remark to make in the Brussels scene. We are seeing the opportunities of electrification, not only direct for heat, but longer term, looking into new furnaces, new crackers, but also methane pyrolysis as a new technology, CCU, CCS, biomass, and a lot. Now, what's interesting, and Stefan mentioned the Chinese, is I look a bit tired and I need to apologize with my team, but I woke up this morning virtually in China in the annual CEO dialogue with the Chinese, where, of course, they were discussing the Chinese targets. There will be a lot of cooperation, and I'll dare to say on a number of fronts they might be faster than we are, because they combine something we don't have. They combine a huge but also growing market, where in Europe we're more or less stable markets. One of the growth areas will be Africa below us, but the challenge for Europe is a triple. We need to completely revamp the technology, we need to revamp the energy system, and our population and markets are relatively stable in demand, which makes that global investments in this region will be challenging. Now, the technologies we have in sight, When the Commission publishes a target, what we normally do is we dive into the impact assessment. And if you take two numbers out, you'll see that the modeling says by 2030, the electricity sector needs to go -70 and industry -25 compared to 2015. We're now further detailing that. And that's where I'd like to say a few words on the numbers. I think we need to move beyond the debate which says this technology is right or wrong, or this country should do this and this country should do that. Because if you see, carbon capture might be smart next to the North Sea, but far more difficult in the middle of Germany or somewhere in Spain, where methane pyrolysis might make a lot of sense somewhere in the middle of the continent, but maybe not on the coast. So what we're doing in CEFIC is we're establishing a transition monitor below the impact assessments of the Commission to see that we can model the technologies, the sector, in the shape of clusters. Not so much countries, but the main chemical clusters in Europe, for which we also need the help of Commission data in the shape of infrastructure. Where's the pipelines? Where's the grids? What's the investment needed? Et cetera, et cetera. What we definitely need is a massive volume of renewable electricity to shape this electrification. What we also need, and I'll stop it there, is on the policy side, consistent policy. Just a few remarks, and I'm sure we're going to get back on it. You'll need to have the policy that fits the different sectors. You might really want to consider if you don't want 2 ETSs instead of bringing a transport sector into an industrial ETS with a very different abatement curve. We have challenges in Germany where the AEG situation actually is prohibitive against more electrification. Mrs. Vestager, and you have heard us this week, just decided to take the core of the chemical industry off the indirect compensation list for ETS, which increases the electricity cost instead of decreases, which we seriously just can't comprehend in combined with the same week a 55% target. But more beyond, what we need is the dialogue. We're also going to get a chemical strategy of sustainability mid-October, which then policy-wise puts a huge agenda on the new chemistries we'll need to make and the changes. If you don't combine that in a sectoral Green Deal for the industry, 10 years is far too short. Summary on our side, we're ready for the dialogue. I think we have the evidence and the data available. We'll need to combine the chemical policy, the Green Deal policy, the farm to fork, the impact on fertilizers with the hydrogen strategy and the climate policy, and work together for the next 10 years and probably longer. And there's a final remark. If you want our sector to be ready in 2050, you need to have the first of a kind breakthrough by 2030, because it takes a decade or two to roll it out across the industry. Now that's a lot, very dense, but I hope it starts the debate.
So I want to bring in Jytte here. So Jytte, you're the rapporteur on the climate loss file in the ENVI committee, and you told our colleague Kalina a few months ago that your actual goal was to get a pretty high emissions cut passed through. You wanted to slash 65% by 2030. That goal was ultimately lowered to 60% in the committee's report, and the Commission's assessment shows that its lower target will nonetheless require a massive shift in how the bloc functions. Going to the points that Marco was making about his own industry and about the targets, I do want to ask, how do you respond to industry's position that perhaps some of the goals coming out of Parliament are a bit too ambitious or maybe slightly far-fetched for the reality of the situation?
Thank you, Aitor, for bringing this discussion and also hosting this discussion, and also giving me the opportunity to take part of it. First of all, before answering the question, I would like to say that we are going to a massive transition, and we are doing something historic, going from our tradition in EU as a coal and steel union to climate neutral union. This is huge, and it shows the commitment and the responsibility that the EU would like to take. And I think that is also global leadership. No one said this would be easy. No one said that it's going to be a piece of cake for any sector to go through this, or for the society as a whole. I mean, we are built on fossil fuels is founding the whole society and the economy. So of course it's a big challenge. We still have enormous work to do. But that being said, I think the sectors really are helped by very precise, not precise, that's the wrong word, to have predictability along this trip. And I don't see that we are helping Europe's industry by telling you could take it easy the first 10 years. If we should deliver to the Paris Agreement, we need to do more these 10 years. Science is crystal clear about it. And I think also democratically, there is a responsibility to the citizens to deliver. And I think what's important here is to see that sectors can have different challenge and opportunities. And we need to have a constant dialogue on with the sectors on how that can be both how we can overcome the obstacles and gain from the challenge instead of being too late. Ambition is nothing that I would say we could privilege to let go, but we can absolutely try to invest clever, also see if there are some years who is particularly difficult for some sectors. Personally, I like the idea of having roadmaps on the EU level, not obligatory, but something where we could help the sectors to have both predictability, also be a bit more mainstreamed to other sectors, so it would be more understandable for the EU institutions, but also as a tool to have that constant dialogue with business. Politician level can never be expert on how the situation is in the floor and how it works in practice, but we can have a constant dialogue on how we can help each other to reach this ambitious target for Europe. But I will never say that let's do it in the next decade. I believe that is too late.
And Jutta, before we move on from the climate law, I just wanted to ask, you also told Kalina when the file came out of the committee that you thought the 60% target that was approved was a good compromise. Are you confident that it will get through the plenary vote, and are you looking forward to also seeing it pass when this goes into the trilogue negotiations?
European Parliament for one mandate now, for I would say long enough to not say that I would be sure about anything. I know that things can shift between committee vote and the plenary vote, of course. But I'm very happy that we were finding a majority for ambitious targets to 2030. And I believe what we reached is possible for Europe to reach, and not only possible, but also necessary if we want to be in line with what's necessary to also delivering for the Paris Agreement. But I must be clear, 60% is too low to deliver for the Paris Agreement. So we even need to do more in the sectorial legislation. That's why it's so important to also focus on investment, technology, the possibilities for Europe, and have the strategies there. I mean, I listened to the previous speakers, and I really agree to many of the things that have been said about the opportunities. And Europe needs to be there with the electrification, with the hydrogen strategy, with the battery strategy. Make sure that we really give the possibilities and are a bit ahead when it comes to the obstacles that the different sectors will face. But that is not about ambition. Ambition, we don't afford to not be ambitious. That will not help anyone in the situation where we are regarding the global heating.
So moving on from ambitions to actual practical steps, and I want to open up this question to all of you. I'd like to know what role you guys think both Brussels, in terms of the European Union, and national governments should play in terms of fostering the development of low-carbon technology. So let's go ahead and start with Stefan.
Yes. In terms of developing new technologies, I was also listening to the other speakers, and I think we need a dual approach, that certain things we need to do at European level, and the first thing we need to do is to have a strong carbon price across the board in order to give a level playing field in terms of rewarding low carbon investments. So the strengthening of the ETS, of course, at the European level is at the heart. At the same time, of course, there are many solutions, and the solutions might indeed be different in different countries. Some countries might have big biomass resources. Other countries might be close to the North Sea or the Baltic Sea, where there is a large offshore wind potential. Other countries might have a large solar potential. So not always the solution is exactly the same, but by using a common carbon price, that leaves the flexibility for the industry to find the best solutions. At the same time, another instrument that is part of our industrial strategy that came out early this year is the concept of important projects of common European interest. And that is also quite interesting how it's a quite new instrument, but it has been applied now, tested with the Battery Alliance. And that was a sector I remember 3-4 years ago when we were discussing the CO2 and cars legislation, that there was a big fear that we would actually lose out when we were transitioning towards, for instance, zero emission vehicles and electric vehicles. But what we see today is that we are reshoring the industry, and we see many investment projects now emerging in Europe along the value chain of batteries. We are thinking about the same, or the same is being set up for hydrogen, and there's also talk about to do that for more general for what we call low carbon industries, which we used to call actually energy intensive industries, but the names are changing. So that is actually an interesting concept because it can, on the one hand, use ideas and projects that are emerging bottom up with member states, with industries, while at the same time create a common framework at European level around that, because in the end it's also a question of being able to provide state aid in the context of an internal market. So that concept, I think, is also quite helpful in bringing those technologies forward.
So let me toss this out to Jessica now. Jessica, what are your thoughts?
So I think it's important to have clear rules and predictable rules, because if our industry is quite slow moving, and I think that goes for most of the industries we have talked about today. And we need to know what will happen over time and also understand the impact of different type of technologies. So really important to set the targets and be clear on that. Then I think it's also about speeding up the adoption of new technology. There is always an adoption curve, and we can help to, or you as policymakers and also countries can support the increased speed of the adoption by having, for instance, incentives. We see very clearly then that those type of incentives or tax regulations supporting clean technology, it pays off and it clearly puts a higher speed in the demand for new technology when we have that. So I think those two are very important. Then, of course, this will require massive R&D the coming years. There will not be one technology that will solve all of this. We have already talked about that several times today. But for instance, in our industry, I think it will be a mix of electric, it will be fuel cell vehicles, but we will also need to have some kind of biofuel, like bio-LNG, for instance. We think that is an interesting fuel. And to be able to invest in all technologies at the same time, then we need to have the support and the possibility to make this transition.
And Marco, I assume you also agree that clear and consistent rules are going to be important in this process?
I do, but I'm going to be a bit sharp in your direction, and that's, if I can, Aitor. You made the bridge between me and Mrs. Gutteland saying industry says this is too ambitious. I didn't say that.
Okay.
I said, and I'm sorry to be so sharp.
No, of course.
We are actually more ambitious because where I want to go, the Chinese are now in the race. Okay. What's our goal? Our goal is to have the production in Europe be at least at par with the Chinese, who have an easier life because they have a bigger market and growing markets. It would be great if by 2050, actually we see all around the world stranded assets of those who didn't follow, except in Europe and in China and elsewhere, there's the new technology in place. So what I try to raise is time for the dialogue, and Mrs. Guteland mentioned that, and we are in dialogue with her as well. I think industry clarifies the ambition is probably even bigger, and we do this with steel, cement, and chemicals. If you want to do CCS, it's steel, cement, and chemicals in that sense as well. All having, which was already clear at the first reports, I think Stefan made for Connie Hedegaard, that we have this track where it's getting more efficient, and then we need breakthrough technologies, which is not different from the modeling now, which says the minus 25, really, really tough. And then breakthrough technologies have to come. Now, why am I so passionate about it? We have this triple thing to do. We have to explain to global CEOs, you invest in a stable market where technology is already relatively old, where the competition is moving as well, where you need to revamp, get the markets, etc., where we want to be the front runners in the world. And that's where Stefan rightfully said, this is actually an investment policy. The one and only question on the table for us is, how do we sell Europe around the world? How do we show the opportunities so that the next investment of this big company actually lands here? Okay. With the latest of current technology today. And that's where I say this is not about ambition or not, because we have publicly said we support the climate neutrality target in 2050. Mm-hmm. We would add on, and then we want to be the best and the biggest chemical industry in the world, for which you need to really take a look at our sector and go into the clusters and look. And that's a comment on policy as well, and a discussion we've had with people in the parliament. We would want this approach to be European. If you get a national Belgian policy and a national Dutch policy, where from BASF and Antwerp, I can cross the fence and be in the Netherlands, I just need to reach, that doesn't make sense either. So look at the sectors, look at the clusters, look at the challenges, look at this investment challenge of getting $1 billion invested here in Europe, which is only possible if we work with the policymakers and we get beyond this debate on targets. That's a political debate. For us, it's the numbers, the 25%. But then the real question, can we get the electricity renewable here? Can we get the hydrogen pipelines in, which is where we need to focus on right now? And when I say 10 years, breakthrough technology is still 10 years out. So you need to have the industry make the money the next 10 years to save up to invest in breakthroughs. But that's the first one, investing. Then you need another period before every installation in Europe has had the potential. So I'm a bit sharp with you, which is a bad thing on a panel. But
I want to clarify this to make sure that we're all on the same page. So to be clear, do you think that the ambitious targets that are coming out of Brussels are realistic and targets that you guys can meet at this moment?
The honest answer, we think they're very ambitious. Do we know how to get there? No. Is it clear they're there? Yes. Mm-hmm. And we'll have to work extremely hard to first get there, but also get the investments to get there. So what you see when CEFIC comes out in public, for us, 2050 is 2 investment cycles away. What's clear as well, and let's make that point, is that reduction in industry is not linear. It's not a linear reduction curve in ETS if you look at investments in the industry. It's going to go like this. And we need the understanding that's the case. And then ambitious is ambitious, but the amount of support we're going to get determines the amount of investments we can make in Europe. And that's why I mentioned this practical and the indirect compensation. That's where policy just doesn't make sense. That's where I have to go to my CEOs and say, we need to electrify. They say, yes, let's do it. But by the way, if you do it, you lose your exemptions. And by the way, everyone gets compensated, but you don't. So your electricity price is higher than your competition. And that comes to, let's throw it in, carbon border measures. Mm-hmm. If you look at our industry, actually our trade with China is about 16 billion in and 16 billion out. Mm-hmm. Our trade with the UK is 20 billion in and 20 billion out, just for a comparison. But we have a 46 billion trade surplus value we bring back to Europe. Our question on the carbon border measures is not how do you protect us from imports. Our question is how do you safeguard our exports? Because you want that value to be brought back to Europe. Now, we don't have the answer right away, but a generic carbon border measure protecting us from imports is not going to help us. And taking free allocation away compared to global competitors means we just got more expensive on the global market. Now, for that, you need dialogue. It's too much for a panel right now. But you need a razor-sharp tool and not generic policies, for which this topic of sectoral approaches is actually very interesting. So thanks.
That seems like a direct criticism for our members here in the Brussels panel. Jytte, what are your thoughts?
I must say, when I listen to Marco, that I get encouraged. I feel that we really have a new situation here where we work more together, and there is a message that I hear, at least, I hope I don't misunderstand it, but that for Europe is actually important for the jobs, for the future, that the business is in line with this transition and not too late, and that there is I would say the message is that we don't afford to be too late. That would actually harm also industries in Europe. But then, of course, we need help to do it, and we also need to have the investment plan for Europe, so we help in this transition. I also hear that. I can never give from my view, or neither my group or in the parliament, a blank check that every investment should be paid from tax money. But of course, there will be different situation for different industries and also different sectors where money is needed, and where Europe needs to be part of it, and where EU needs to be part of it. And I think we need to talk about it every time, so we have a plan that is helpful where the obstacles might be. And that being said, I think the Commission is now much more eager to deliver with the climate law and also the climate neutrality for 2050. And I think also when we hear the news from China, we understand that this is a necessary lead for Europe if we want to be ahead in the competition. But for me, as my conclusion will always be that there is no alternative. This transition needs to be done, and we are all, if not in the same boat, at least in the same sea, as Greta Thunberg said, and therefore we need to help each other to do this. And when I listened to Jessica and heard about the work that is done from Volvo, I also see that there is a new insight that we need to help each other, work across different companies, and really meet the solutions together, and stop talking about maybe ambition and start to talk about how to do it.
So we have about 15 minutes left. I want to toss out one last group question to all of you, but I'd urge relatively brief responses. So last week when he was presenting the impact assessment, Commission Vice President Timmermans said that he was surprised to see that the industrial transformation seemed to be more feasible than he had expected, but he expected that the consequences for households would be deeper than expected. So I'd like to know what each one of you, when you think about the decarbonization process, what is the social impact that worries you the most, or what is the general impact that worries you the most of related to this process? So can we start actually with Stefan right here?
When you look at the impact assessment, one area where you have a particularly high level of change in a 2030 perspective is buildings and heating in buildings. On the one hand, it requires a lot of investments, which requires industrial products, so that's the investment side. But it also means that, first of all, the investment has to happen and needs to be affordable, and we will need to help people in getting those investments done, hence the renovation wave. And then we look at instruments in terms of, we have, of course, on the both sticks and carrots, and if you do something like a carbon price on heating fuels, that increases, of course, the household bill for energy. I wouldn't exaggerate that, but on the other hand, you do have a situation, and again, I'm looking in particular at the most vulnerable income groups, and of course, those vulnerable income groups are also more in the poorer countries of Europe. That can be an element. And that is, I think, very clear in the assessment and in the communication that the distributional aspects of that will need to be addressed. We will need their social policies in order to make sure that, well, we've called it before, leave no one behind. Right. And that is a clear message that I think comes from both the assessment and clearly in the communication.
What do you think, Jessica?
Really hard question. What is the toughest? I mean, there are so many things that are tough. How will we get enough green energy available? How can we speed up the transition? Because it takes time to renew the entire fleet. But it's also a very exciting time, I think, to be part of this industry. We often talk about that. It's remarkable to be able to do this transition in such a short time. And I think a lot of people find energy from that. We can actually make a huge difference if we succeed, and we must succeed, as we have talked about earlier today. So I think I'm more focused on the things that needs to happen to make this transition than all the obstacles, because I think we can sit here all night debating on everything that is going to be tough. If I should say one thing, I think the initial cost for this new technology is going to be a challenge.
Okay, Marco?
I'll give you a personal response if I can, because one of the things we do in trade federations is we travel the world and Europe. Also, in our case, where there's not so much chemistry left, which is in the central and eastern region of Europe, and where it's us standing on stage talking to the local people and the engineers working in what is relatively old technology and old sites. So one of the key challenges I see in industry is that the Green Deal drives to scale. Those companies who need to make the investment will get bigger again. And the same on the chemical policy side, where why do we still win in competition in Europe? It's specialty chemicals, it's SMEs, and the fact that we work so closely together. So one challenge in industry is, can everyone follow? The second one is, and I said personal, if I go north to my home country, to the Netherlands, and you discuss this is a debate in a bubble. It's a debate not many people follow. And sometimes I drive with my family, I say I've just been to these and these countries, and then my uncle says, I go on holiday once a year. You're really weird. Really, he's a policeman, he's retired. But why am I saying that? The cost will go up, not everyone will follow, electricity will be more expensive, people will find it a challenge, and it's going to be easy to point either to industry or to policymakers, etc. Also on industry side, we'll have a lot of explaining to do, that we are part of the transition, but that's a costly exercise, and that indeed cost will go up as well. At the end of the day, this ends in higher prices for consumers. That's how the economy works. Now, we need to avoid that we come into private households versus maybe elite versus non-elites, north versus south. You need to lot, and that's where I was actually disappointed with the remark by the executive vice president, because it's not going to be easy for anyone. It's going to be very, very hard for industry and very, very hard for everyone else. But like I said, personal remark, maybe not a CEFIC DG remark. I need to go out to CEOs around the world where this morning one of my Chinese colleagues says, this project we have already done, steel gases into a chemical sector. We need to now sell it. So the message, it's easy for industry, doesn't bring investments. Neither the message is easy for citizens, brings understanding. So sure. Apologies if that's a bit too personal, but I think you mean what...
No, I think you raise a valid point in terms of the communications factor. I assume that from the parliament, you guys also will get blowback from citizens who sometimes don't understand the more ambitious goals and so forth. You've also been completely aware of the work done with the Just Transition Fund in terms of attempting to address that social impact. I'm curious to hear your perspective in terms of where you think or where you fear that will suffer the brunt of the decarbonization process.
Yes, absolutely. I think this is one of the more crucial points if we would like to succeed, and we must succeed to reach climate neutrality, then we need to do it in a socially just way. And it has not been the case always. When we see demonstrations against climate policy, it is because the politicians didn't succeed in doing a just transition in parallel with the the work for climate. So I believe that if we are going to do this in a way where we are fast enough, ambitious enough, and also make sure that that we deliver in what we said we should deliver with the Paris Agreement, then we really need to make sure that people are with this travel and not left behind. And we also need to make sure that we have different systems to help to make sure that there is economically support to people who need maybe new jobs, new education, new ways to be able to support themselves. I'm also thinking about energy poverty that is really burdensome for Europe, and there are millions of families, kids who suffer from that today in Europe, and therefore this is also something we need to take into our concern and make sure that we do, when the legislation is built reform by reform, it's actually done to be building also a more just society. The S&D has this as a priority, my political group, and it has. I have been very happy, and many of us very happy when we've seen that the Commission also take this as one of the most important parts of the climate transition. And I believe it's not something, a little part of it. It is actually how we shall succeed with the climate neutrality.
So I want to take some questions from the audience. Again, we're running a little short on time, so if I could ask you all to keep your answers brief. We have one from an anonymous viewer who asks, or says, heavy industry is particularly hard to decarbonize. How can we reduce the need for hard-to-carbonize materials, and what are the main levers for demand reduction? So, Stefan, why don't you take that one on?
Well, in terms of, there's basically two things you can do in terms of decarbonization. Indeed, reduce demand, or indeed make the supply more low carbon. Many of these basic materials are, of course, quite fundamental to how the economy runs. But there are, of course, opportunities between them in terms of material substitution. So they are not, they are partially, not always, but partially replaceable by each other. So that is an opportunity. You also have the opportunity, actually, a lot of people are talking about bioenergy, but also biomaterials is a potential solution for replacing other more carbon-intensive materials, for instance, in the construction industry. But there are also many examples, I think, also relating to chemicals. They might replace also sometimes other materials. On the supply side, we also need to think about how to make them more, how can we create lead markets for those, because we don't have anything like I can buy low-carbon cement when I build my house. That doesn't exist. So we might need to be thinking also about the question about, just like we have now definitions of what is a zero-emission vehicle, we have a definition for that in Europe. We have a definition for, I have a triple A fridge, so I can buy the most energy-efficient fridge. Can we find solutions to say, I am buying low-carbon cement? So that might also be a way when you start defining what you're exactly aiming for, how you can create markets, getting consumers involved, getting producers involved.
We have a question for Marco. Can you please share your views on carbon removal technologies?
CCS, CCU, and trees, by the way. I'm a forester by education, so I include the trees also for the Swedish MEP in this case. We are working on CCU. There's the first applications. There's a company who has carbon molecules in a mattress. We are looking into CCS, which is larger scale. If you see the chemical industry of the future, which we've mapped in our 2050 roadmap, partly will be the managers of the molecules, including the carbon molecules. And that's also how we see, for example, chemical recycling. If you get to a stable level of carbon molecules not being emitted, I'm sorry to be a bit technical there, then CCU and recycling technologies and bio-based are the key tools for the chemical industry. And that's where We think there's a potential, but it will be electrification plus CCU, CCS, biomass, etc. It's one of the options we have on the table, and we see the first signs. The holy grail, and I'm always in love with new technology. You saw Elon Musk last night, but being a Trekkie, my team is going to hate me for doing that. But artificial photosynthesis is all the way out there. That would be the ultimate. Using carbon molecules is a step there. And it's being worked on all through the industry right now. We're going to see a massive technology change. And as I said, the only thing we want is then those technologies to be built in Europe. On the markets, I'm not too worried as Steph as well. We might need a bit of a soapbox, a step up, which could be contracts for difference in political terms, to get the lower carbon materials into the market. Because the capital expenditure, the investments are needed, the operational will be more expensive. You'll need to help to push some of those new materials, substances into the market before consumers will take them.
Let's see if we can squeeze in a couple more. We have a question submitted by Poppy Kalisi of the Environmental Defence Fund. If the EU keeps falling 2.5 trillion euros short of needed spending in green investment by 2027, what is the contingency plan to reach the 2030 target? And there, why don't we have you to jump in?
I didn't
shall I repeat the question?
Hear everything. Can you repeat it for me?
Of course.
Yeah.
This is from Poppy Kalisi, and the question is, if the EU keeps falling 2.5 trillion euros short of needed spending in green investment by 2027, what is the contingency plan to reach the 2030 target?
Yeah, now I see the question. Yeah, absolutely. But I would say, first of all, there must be, when it comes to the investment, it must be a cooperation between the EU, between projects in the member states, between the business, all need to contribute. So it cannot be EU who is the big founder. We need to do it together. But of course, we need to speed up also the investments. And therefore, for me personally, and I know there is a good discussion in my group for this, I think it's important that we also have new means on the EU level to make sure that we get sufficient money and possibilities to invest. And I see very positive to have means coming from ETS, from also carbon border adjustment, plastic, like the Commission is launching itself, also on plastics, we need to collect money. I think this is a very good way of steering both the economy in a good direction by actually making it more pricey to buy the products that is emitting, but it's also very good for our investment possibilities. So I hope that by doing that shift, we would actually get the means we need for the investment needed.
Okay, and one last one that we can throw out to Jessica, and it's a very general one. In terms of the decarbonization of industry, which do you anticipate is going to be the hardest to decarbonize?
The long haul, really heavy transports.
Excellent. So after this fascinating chat, it looks like our main takeaways are that the road to the green transition is going to be extremely difficult and challenging for the industrial sector, but also very promising. Some of the takeaways we took away today was that industry wants clear and predictable rules moving forward so that they can plan. That there is no one-size-fits-all solution to this problem, even though the ETS was cited as a possible way to level the playing field, and that ultimately there's going to be some degree of social hardship ahead, but that it will be something that comes with the ambitious goals that have been set. I want to thank Stefan, Marco, Jessica, and Jytte out there in the virtual world for joining us and for being on the panel today. And I also want to thank our audience for submitting their questions, which were indeed challenging for all of them, I think. I also want to send special thanks to our partner Shell for sponsoring this event. Audience members, please feel free to send us your feedback at events@politico.eu, and make sure to tune in for our next Politico Energy Visions event, which will take place on November 18th and will focus on carbon removal and natural sinks in reaching climate neutrality by 2050. For Politico Europe, I'm Aitor Hernández Morales. Many thanks and good afternoon.